Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third in our series of Downtime, conversations with authors and artists about creativity in lockdown, created in partnership by the Art Gallery of Ontario and the Toronto International Festival of Authors. My name is Roland Gulliver. I'm the director of the Toronto International Festival of Authors, and I'm delighted to be introducing today's event. And I'm delighted to introduce Devyani Saltzman, the AGO Director of Public Programs. Today, she'll be in conversation with Ken Lum, an author of amazing stature and reputation, both in Canada and internationally. He's talking to us from Philadelphia. And he is known for his conceptual and representational art across a number of media. He's currently chair of fine arts at the University of Pennsylvania School of Design in Philadelphia. He's the co-founder and founding editor of Yishu, the Journal of Contemporary Chinese Art, and he himself is a prolific writer. Since the mid-1990s, he has a range of permanent public commissions across cities in Europe and Canada. He's co-conceived and curated a range of large-scale exhibitions, and he's received many awards, including the Officer of the Order of Canada in 2017, and in 2020, he received the Governor-General Visual and Media Arts Award. And in looking into Ken's work, the quote that really struck me was, "You can't progress through life unless you question who you are constantly." Mm. And although this event is in the digital space, we are all rooted in place and history. As a new arrival in Canada and as the director of TIFA, I want to acknowledge that words and ideas have been shared here for thousands of years. I'd like to thank and acknowledge the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat and the Mississaugas of the Credit, who have occupied this land, cared for it, and are sharing it with all Torontonians. The land is also part of the Dish with One Spoon territory, a treaty to peaceably share and protect this land through friendship and respect. The land is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. I'm grateful to be here and to have the opportunity to connect with you from my home to yours. And also, in these times, I acknowledge the work that we need to do to enable and to empower the marginalized, misrepresented, and repressed voices of our societies to be heard, to create more spaces for solidarity, safety, friendship, and respect, and to work harder to listen to those voices and stories. And over to Devyani for another fascinating conversation.
Thank you, Roland, and Ken, so nice to see you in this space, and welcome. I think maybe we'll start with, Roland alluded to where you are, which is Pennsylvania. You're in Philadelphia. You were mentioning before this talk began the feeling around restrictions and the inability to cross the border. What is the view in light of the last 2 weeks from Philadelphia, and what are you thinking about right now?
Well, obviously, the United States is going through a very difficult time, but I also think for the best of reasons. I think there's a lot of hope in the air by a lot of people. People have been surprised by the degree of the protestation and the duration of it. And I think those two are very, very productive signs for that can only engender optimism. There's a lot of problems in terms of social injustice, inequity, immense injustice in terms of the tax rules favoring the very wealthy, a kind of reification of capitalism, a dog-eat-dog version of that, which has become so naturalized as opposed to recognizing it as a kind of religious ideology of America. And now, the veil is being kind of pulled back, and people are really kind of seeing how unsustainable the present model of society is here. So I'm very hopeful at the same time as it's been obviously very trying for a lot of people.
No, I mean, absolutely. And I'm going to get to questions around your practice and what you're thinking about in terms of your artistic practice right now. But I also want to just suggest to people watching, please feel free to put questions in the Q&A, and I will incorporate them through the conversation and at the end. But Ken, I mean, you are also a longtime observer of Canadian ideas of identity and nationhood, and I think in one of your early, or maybe even a more recent blog around Canadian identity debates are broken, let's fix them, you talk about how we need to reflect as much on our own kind of mythologies. So you were mentioning a moment of pulling back the veil in terms of the US and hope. What are you seeing in terms of Canada? Because we are obviously in a similar boat. And I'm just curious to what you're thinking the next narrative is for this nation as a Canadian who's sitting in the States looking across the border.
I actually just, by the way, I'm totally new to social media. And so about 3 weeks ago, my Los Angeles gallery started an Instagram page for me, and which I have access to, and which I'm really enjoying. So I don't know why I'm so late to the party, but I just posted one yesterday about a work I did in 1989 called Mounties and Indians, and I wrote a statement attached to that posting about the very kind of oppressive police state apparatus that circulates to this day without much challenge, I have to say, regarding the control of First Nations lives, right? And I think that is the thing that needs some immediate address on a very, very deep and wide and sustained level in Canada. And I think Canadians have, and I think it's fair to say, Canadians have a degree of satisfaction in terms of a more liberal, more just society than compared to the United States. But I also think there is a degree of complacency and smugness on the part of Canada.
Absolutely.
In terms of just how liberal they believe themselves to be.
No, interesting. And how is all of this infiltrating your mindset as a writer and as a visual artist in terms of your practice? Before the last 2 weeks have kind of exploded, and the last 2 weeks have been happening for years in terms of oppression and systemic racism, but COVID itself has been a very charged space. How have you found time to breathe or think, and what is coming up for you in terms of your own creative practice?
Well, I hope this doesn't sound immodest to say, but I guess a long time ago when I started this journey called being an artist, I made a lot of decisions about what I wanted to express according to my own terms and so on. There was a lot of different pressures being placed on me as a young artist that I should act more like an Asian artist, or I should act and whatever. All these kinds of biases that are already built into this the art system, and that was from being in Canada. So I would have curators come, Canadian curators I won't mention, of major museums in Canada, and saying what you're doing is not very Canadian, and you're just too your work doesn't somehow embody Canadian ideals, and all the while I always thought I was expressing all the things that were true to me as I experienced them growing up in a working class area of Vancouver, which was always not that pleasant. It was always a lot of agonisms, a lot of contestations, and rooted in desperation, traumas, and but vetted through the visual domain that comprised, let's say, Strathcona or East Vancouver, right? And that was through the sign systems, through all kinds of other things. And now I look back and I think I was actually largely correct, right? And that's actually advice. I don't say that to be immodest. I say that as advice to young artists, that you have to stick to what you really feel is the most important path, and the most important avenues available to you that really reflects who you are, that things that are urgent to you that you need to say according to the way you can best say it. Yeah. And don't listen to opinions sometimes, right? Especially, and that's not easy because a lot of that opinion is backed by power and authority. right?
Well, I think this is a moment of reckoning around power and authority, and you know, you're reiterating the need for authenticity in one's practice. Which artists are you looking at right now that are inspiring you, or whose work is speaking to you?
Oh gosh, I mean, I think there's a lot of artists. I mean, in recent years, I've been more inspired by writers than artists, to be honest. I mean, I think there's lots of really good artists and so on, but I think there's you know, I get inspired by let's put it this way. I invent a lot of courses, seminar courses, which end up being quite popular at the University of Pennsylvania. And so, this past term, I taught a course called The Chinese Body and this Protection of Space in Chinatown. And so that course was started with, you know, the history of obviously the Opium Wars, and which the end of it, which kind of overlapped with the American Civil War. And so I was really interested in the kind of triangulation of comparative racism between yellow bodies, black bodies, and some brown bodies, and of course white bodies, right? Some of which was also subjugated, such as Irish bodies and so on, and Jewish bodies. And so I've been reading a lot of books from Edley Wong called Racial Reconstruction, and about Black inclusion and Chinese exclusion, and the fictions of citizenship. I've been reading, let's see, the Chinatown Trunk Mystery. I can't remember the first name, by Liu. I can't remember the first name, but it's a great book, and it's all about kind of mapping and of Chinese bodies in Manhattan, namely in the late part of the 19th century after the 1882 Exclusion Act. Right, and then about rumors and gossip and reporting in tabloid newspapers of where these bodies would go, and so on. So I tend to read a lot, but I read a lot of things in a very in a kind of constellational way, based on what I'm kind of interested in. So I was interested in you know, the kind of precursor history, you might say, of the so-called model Asian body today, which is so kind of highly racialized and problematic classification. And so I wanted to, and then I realized there was very little in terms of a course that was offered on that. That
must have been great to go through the design process. It sounds like you get a lot of joy through putting that together.
Yeah, but there's a big intersection in terms of all my seminars. They have obviously a design, they have an art component, they have a visual component, they have an urban studies component, they have a planning component, they have history component. And so I get a lot of students and in my classes, like including PhD students, and they come from geography, they come from sociology, and so on. So it's a bit unusual. That's why the university always funds my courses, I guess.
That's a fun thing to have. I'm curious. I mean, so much of your work is in the public realm and at the intersection of visual culture and urban geography. What do you see in terms of the role of the public realm as we emerge, if and when we emerge into quote unquote a new normal, if that's what it's called, post-COVID? We're seeing Vancouver just opened up in the last week, and we're seeing congregations in parks, some restaurants open. Where I am right now in Toronto is closed. I'm not sure where Philadelphia, I think Philadelphia is relatively closed. What is the role of the public realm over the next 5 years? And that's a big loaded question. But just your thoughts on the importance of the public realm.
Well, I would say the public realm in the United States is much more compromised than it is in Canada, right? It's become much more territorialized according to who has money, who doesn't have money, right? And that's aligned to the kind of state apparatus of policing, which is also aligned to moneyed interests. And so in the United States, I think, and of course, as a result of that, you have theorists like Saskia Sassen, who believes that the only true public realm is something what she called la terrain vague, meaning that these kind of desolate areas that nobody wants to go to, these kind of fields where a building may have been torn down, and that's the only place where you can actually generate real public dialogue, right? I mean, I think that's very pessimistic, right? And so on, because you will have to have gatherings of wayward souls and kids and homeless, whatever, in these spaces. It's very pessimistic, right? But I do think it is incumbent on people to recognize these limits and try to produce space in a public way. And I think that's what the protests are doing right now. They're actually producing space. I mean, it's important to go back to Desserteau and Michel Desserteau and recognize that it's not placemaking that's important, it's space making that's important.
Exactly.
Right? A place is just a geographical point, a nodal point, right? And a place is totally benign as a concept. What's important is space, and space is an activation of dialogue and politics within any site, and it could be at any unpredictable point as well.
And are you hopeful about that? Are you hopeful that spaces are going to be maintained? I mean, I'm also thinking of these things as well, and obviously, it seems like we're on a bit of an edge about which way things will fall. Forgive me, I'll stop babbling. I'm just curious to your thoughts.
No, I'm an artist, so I have to be hopeful. I think that at the root of being an artist is, and I've written a lot. By the way, I don't consider myself an author, right? So, but I've written some essays and so on. So I'm always hopeful. That's why I do things, right? That's why I believe in the critique and the negative of things. That's why I believe in challenging authority and questioning things through my in my way, of course, through my art and through my writings.
What are your next initiatives?
Well, I'm from that Chinese course I mentioned. I taught. I started a screenplay, and I wrote a screenplay, which actually had developed. I don't know anything about writing a screenplay, by the way, and I also don't know much about Hollywood, except as someone who takes in some films sometimes. And so, but it had multiple producer interests. So,
oh, congratulations.
Yeah. And so right now, it's with, I can't mention, but it's undergone its third and final review. And it's already gone off to a line producer. I had to look up what a line producer was. And now it looks very hopeful for production.
I always think of you as an artist and a writer, by the way. And I think writing in any medium, and the fact this is partly a partnership with TIFA, I think it's exciting that you work in multiple spaces. So I'm excited to see what that screenplay, how it evolves. We have a question from our audience, but should the artist always be a public intellectual?
No, the artist shouldn't always be a public intellectual, but I do think that art I do think that it's incumbent on the artist to make intelligent art. Okay, and that intelligent art could take the form of abstract painting, right? And intelligence can also, for example, let me just say, like Jackson Pollock was he was a bit of a lush, right? He liked the bottle and so on, and probably was not an intellectual in the sense of an academic and so on, but did he make incredibly intelligent art? Yes. And why? Because he had a very profound sense of embodying sense of the moment he was in historically. And so artists have to be intelligent and intellectuals in that sense.
Absolutely. What are you doing in your time of self-isolation and distancing? How do your days look? How are you spending your time? Are you able to walk?
Well, I am walking the same walk every day because there's only so many places you can walk, but I'm spending a lot of time with my kids. I realized that even when I was on campus, I'd come home and I was always working. And, and so, or I'd come home and I'd be so tired from work, I would need to crash soon, right? So it's been a silver lining to be able to be with my wife and kids and so on. And it's made a real big difference. I've kind of rediscovered them. I'm almost ashamed to say, and how amazing they are.
I think you're not alone in that. I think a lot of people are discovering how much time They have not been within, if people are fortunate, in a familial kind of nexus. And the fact that that time exists for you is, I think, obviously a gift, right?
Yeah, it is a gift. And as I mentioned, I finished my third revision of the script, so that has taken up time. And actually, it almost required pandemic time for me to work on, because you have to be totally, to use a basketball term, in the zone of writing it and so on.
So when you're teaching full time and you don't necessarily have this moment, how are you balancing your own creativity with your teaching requirements and your professorial work? Do you, within sabbatical spaces, or do you take time away once a week? How do you manage that?
Well, I mean, I was due for sabbatical a while ago, and I haven't taken it because I just feel I've just got too much stuff to do on campus. I guess I should take it since it's coming to me, right? But I mean, I can say that, you know, the screenplay, right, was started during the interregnums between meetings I had at campus.
Right.
Right. So I always try to create a project. My wife would say, why don't you just take it easy? I mean, you had such a hard day. You have an hour break, walk around the campus. It's beautiful there, and get some air. Right. But instead, I kind of sit in front of the computer. I think I'll start on this project, and then I really get into it. And so I would say that for a long time, and this, I don't recommend this to others, but because it's not very salubrious, is that for a long time, I took pride, maybe overdetermined pride, regarding working, doing multitasking.
Right.
Right. And I got kind of hooked on it. And now I realize it's totally stupid. It's actually quite damaging. And you really do need time to walk around campus, as my wife says, during certain breaks, right? Because it's not healthy. But I've been doing it for such a long time that I never questioned it, and I was even proud of it. You know, I would always, if someone said, "Would you do this as a project?" Even though I was up to here in terms of projects, I'd say, "Sure, I'll do it. I could squeeze it in."
As someone who kind of examines capitalism and class and multiple things through your work, does that not just reinforce the kind of myth of productivity that you critique so well?
Yeah. Well, it was, except I wasn't doing it for capitalism's sake, right?
You were doing it for yourself.
Yeah, I was doing it for things I was, or at least I thought I was. But I realized that, you know, as I get older, because I'm not young anymore, it was, I was having a harder and harder time managing it.
Yeah.
So, and yeah.
Ken, you're part of a large institution as a post-secondary. Obviously, we are part of large cultural institutions. What do you feel the role of the institutions will be coming out of the last 2 weeks of political violence and calls for ends to systemic racism and also COVID? What are the roles of our cultural shared spaces or the academy?
Right. Well, I mean, I have a slightly romantic view of the academy as a kind of intellectual free space. And I think it still retains that, but I do think it has also been a little bit congealed in terms of our over belief in it being a free space, right? Because you know, there's you know, I mean, I'll say it. I think there's a lot of mediocrity on campus as well in the academy, and. But that said, I do think we need to rethink education. That's a kind of bisected question that would apply slightly differently from for
cultural institute, or for Canada and the United States.
Because okay. I'm at Penn, and Penn is part of the so-called Ivy League, right? There's like over 15 billion in the endowment of the university. I mean, billion.
Yeah.
Right. And but I do think that, you know, and there, of course, it is a kind of great institution. They do a lot of good. I do believe that. At the same time, you know, tuition is, I mean, you'd scream.
The barriers to access are insane.
Yeah, freshman tuition there is $64,000 a year, right? Yeah. US, that's like 100,000 Canadian, right? And so, you know, even though there's, you know, there are access points in terms of subsidies for students, I do think something's gone awry in the entire American education system between elite schools and non-elite schools, public and private. And even the public schools, because I recall Berkeley before Reagan, and these kind of great public universities were highly regarded, and they still are to a degree, but it's diminuted, I would say. And tuition was actually much lower. And then even the public schools became very expensive, at least in the United States. Yeah. I think in Canada, it's a little bit different because, you know, tuition is obviously much more affordable, but I also think universities, by and large in Canada, are much more mediocre.
Are you thinking a lot? I mean, you're discussing it right now in light of the Academy, but in your own work as well, you've done your public installations have examined kind of class divides and even geographical class divides. Your famous piece, East Van on the Strathcona kind of border. What are you thinking right now in terms of what's being highlighted in terms of class divides, which are also often falling alongside racial divides?
Right. Well, class divides is one of those things which you know, is actually used to attack people regarding silencing them, right? I mean, that's a real tactic of the right, where they'll say, there you go again, bringing up class issues, right? And of course, the association with that is, the illusion with that is that you're a closet socialist or communist and so on, right? And of course, the true class subvention is that tax money is subsidizing the very wealthy and powerful all the time, right? And so there is a class war going on, and that class war is being enacted by the wealthy towards the poor, right? And yet if the poor protest and say, you know, this is an issue of class, the rich person says to the poor person, there you go again, class war.
Right. Another near final question from the audience. Ken, can you share insights on refugee migratory experience and how it might relate to your current artistic practice?
Well, these are big questions.
I'm sorry. This was actually supposed to be, but how can we not?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start by saying that, you know, I've traveled a lot, right? Probably too much. And all that time I was traveling, I was kind of writing about what I observed, and with great sympathy, I hope, and empathy. But at the same time, I never realized how it's basically unsustainable it was. I guess all the traveling itself was a privilege, which I recognize, but I never kind of tied it to environmental and global degradation of the environment and so on. I mean, I think, you know, it's difficult. There used to be a time when you had, you know, thousands of people trying to move across a border because of all kinds of reasons. Could be an earthquake, could be political, and so on. But it seemed somewhat quaint and even small number compared to today. Nowadays, you can actually have overnight 1 million people amassing at a border somewhere. Right, so they just numerically, it's quite shocking, right? And I do think it behooves, you know, because that issue of class and in social injustice and equity is a global question. It's a global problem that needs to be addressed globally, right? And the answer clearly isn't to create to further conditions which exist today that basically promulgates people to move, right? The issue is to help out local conditions wherever they may be to prevent people having to move, right? That's the issue, right? And so instead we have this kind of paradox whereby conditions are so terrible, which is actually promulgated in large part by the developing world towards the developed world towards the developing world, such as the World Bank rules and all kinds of things like that, and which causes people to move, creates all kinds of disasters, including you know, propping up of authoritarian dictatorships in all kinds of countries, and yet at the same time we don't want them to come here, right? We force them to leave, but we don't want them to come here, so we put up walls and customs rules that prevent them from coming here. that is a totally unsustainable situation.
And just on behalf of this person's question, absolutely all true. How is that working into your artistic practice? I mean, you've looked at it over the years through many works, but right now is kind of migration and the liminal kind of trapped space you're defining. Is that working into whether it's your writing or visual practice or public commissions in the last year or so?
Well, I think, the idea of difference and identity and the roots of identity has always been salient in my work, right? Yeah. So, I don't necessarily explicitly refer to, immigration and such, yeah. But it has always been there in my work.
No, absolutely. And I think the question was more specifically, was there any specific project? But you're right, it's thematically at the base of yeah. all you do. There's two quick questions and then we're going to wrap up. But a question is, how do you see the move to online teaching affecting how and what you teach and how students think?
Well, it's a mixed bag. Online teaching is kind of it works if it's in the sense that you can reach many more students. For example, I was teaching a class and during the pandemic, which is ongoing, and there were students who moved back to Korea, for example, and they were still participating in class. I was also able to invite all kinds of scholars who otherwise we couldn't travel. Maybe travel or yeah. Even afford to travel because it would have meant hotel and the logistics of airfare and so on. Mm-hmm. And so on that level, there is a kind of democratizing going on in terms of that. But I do think the negative part is, of course, there's no real person-to-person physical presence. That is so indispensable to teaching, right? In fact, not just teaching, but to the kind of social, character of people. We need to be able to be in front of someone else. So, if the student's asking me a question on Zoom, it's very hard to kind of you lose a lot in terms of the tics, the various, microscopic gestures and the tonality of what the student is posing. Yeah. At the moment of the questions being posed. And so that's lost, right? And there's no real pause, right? It's like horror vacui on Zoom, right? An hour and a half seminar would take only an hour on Zoom, right? There's no break, right? It's unnatural, right? And you can't move around. I can't stand up. I can't go to a blackboard, and so on. There's no kind of even repartee.
So the democratization of space, but the limiting of how we interact with each other.
Yeah, and of course it's mediated through an intermediary, which is technology and so on, which is and the point of human contact is it's unmediated.
In light of technology, a fun light question, and then I'm just going to ask you for some closing thoughts. But the question is, what is your Zoom background?
The Zoom background is a virtual background of a nice hotel room. I just got it off Google search because I miss being in a nice hotel room.
Fair enough, and very real. I just, in closing, Ken, just thank you so much for your time and giving us an insight into what you're thinking about right now. And obviously, it's been a big year for you. What are some final thoughts in terms of where you see us? There's a big us collectively going in terms of North America post these past period of time and COVID. And any last thoughts on how your practice is shifting? And
another big question.
I know. Also, I'm
well, first of all, I wouldn't delineate it to North America, but I would delineate it to the responsibility of the developed world, the rich world, that to really think hard about these questions of environmental degradation, social degradation that's taking place on a massive level. I mentioned the condition of First Nations lives in Canada. We can start there. I mean, you go through any kind of reservation, and even in terms of administrative policies of denial of service from from insurance companies to grant giving companies, all kinds of things that could help First Nations. I think we start there, and we travel out, I would say, at least in Canada.
And Black Lives.
And Black Lives, of course. And in terms of my own work, I feel like I've been following my own path, right? I'm curious about a lot of things, curious about too many things, and I'm unsettled by a lot of things, and that has always motivated me in terms of what I want to say.
No, I mean, that curiosity, that insatiable curiosity is so evident. And I feel, thank you so much for the pleasure of speaking to us today. Very excited to hear more about your new venture into screenplay writing.
Yeah, I'm not a screenplay writer, just like I'm not an author, but it just got
When
good
that
traction.
comes up.
So we'll see what happens.
Thank you so much, and have a good rest of the day in Philadelphia.
Yeah, thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.